We have some panelists with us today. I know a lot of students will watch this after the fact, so I hope you get some value out of this. And of course, the Career Center is open all summer. OCI starts now. The application period is open for 6 weeks, so you have time. So this is just to get the process going. The sooner you come in, the better. And we'll have just a formatting thing for those who are actually in the Zoom room here. We'll do question and answer with all the panelists. We're going to carve out some time at the end for questions. If something's really pressing in during the program, if there's only 3 of you here at this point, like you could also chime in. There's the raise hand function. I'm sure we can, it won't get it too disheveled to do that. And so I guess just to start off, maybe we go around the room with the panelists. Rachelle, since you're in my top left-hand corner, I'll start with you. And then if you want to call on the next panelist, we'll just go that way.
Sure, thanks, Felipe. My name is Rachelle Collins. My pronouns are she, her. I am an associate at Stoel Rives in the Portland office. I am in the general litigation group. Other than litigation, I really don't have any specific focus right now. I do a lot of random things, from litigating contracts to representing healthcare institutions to representing smaller businesses and all kinds of things like that. I graduated from U of O in 2021, and I did OCIs, and that's how I ended up. I was supposed to be a summer at Stoel, but that would have been summer of 2020, and so that was canceled, but I did go through the OCI process, and then eventually got myself here for grad. And I'll turn it to Malcolm.
There, I'm Malcolm Williamson. I use both they, them, and he, him pronouns. Either are great anytime. I work at Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt in the Portland office, where I'm a second-year litigation associate. I was part of Rachelle's graduating class at U of O in 2021. And very similarly to Rachelle, I'm in general litigation, and I do a very wide variety of practice areas. I litigate contracts towards including things in maritime law, landlord-tenant law, real estate, construction, trust and estates, insurance, etc. Just lots of projects all over the place. I started at Schwabe as a 1L diversity fellow, and then I participated in OCI my second year in law school. I had several interviews, and then I chose to return to Schwabe for a second summer. That summer also got canceled because of COVID, and so I started as an associate after graduation. And now I participate in Schwabe's callback panel interviews. And Lauren, feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks, Rachelle, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Lauren, and I work at Tonkon Torp. My practice, I'm also a litigator. My practice emphasis within litigation is complex real estate disputes, but I have a gen lit practice as well. And I would say about 20% of my practice is bankruptcy and creditors' rights type work, mostly focusing on adversary proceedings within bankruptcy and not just general bankruptcy filings. I graduated from the U of O in 2016. I worked for a firm in Eugene for my first 4 years of practice, and then I joined Tonkon Torp in 2020, just right before the pandemic. And how I've participated in the past in OCIs, I participated in OCIs as a student at the U of O. That's how I got work with my first firm, which is Gleave Swearingen, and then I've been involved in the interview process on this side of it now at Tonkon. I don't know specifically for OCIs if I've done those, but interviewing generally for sure. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Julia.
Hey all. So I'm Julia, pronouns she, her. So I'm at Watkinson Laird in Eugene. I graduated in 2002 from law school, so I've been at it for a while. My practice for the first 15 years was debtor side bankruptcy, Chapter 11 commercial type work. Almost 7 years ago now, I joined Watkinson Laird, and so now my practice is again bankruptcy arena, but creditor side. Also a transactional practice, all the things associated with business work, some real estate transactions. So that's what I do. And I've been involved in helping with the OCIs for the last handful of years for the firm. So that's me.
Thank you, panelists. Now we move on the agenda items to moderated questions. So I will throw them out there and just feel free to, like I was saying before, chime in. If the question doesn't move you, feel free to not chime in. So the first one is, what tips do you have for preparing application materials? Anyone want to start?
Sure, I'll start. I have a couple of my partners that help review the submissions, and we still see the occasional typos, which seems obvious, but have a third party look at your stuff before you send it in. The other is anything that's interesting about you, right? You think about, that we want to look at your GPA and, all the, I don't know, I am drawn to people's life experiences, other business experience, anything that they're going to bring in that isn't just that, I'm the top of the class and blah, 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 blah. Something that really, what's unique about you and what do you bring to the firm? What do you bring to the practice?
I would echo that and just say that the stuff that we can see on your resume doesn't probably need to go in your cover letter. You don't need to repeat your class rank or anything like that. But yes, what Julia said, just interesting things that you have, or if you have a connection in particular with the firm or with the area, I think that's useful to mention as well.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I also would say, be careful of, it's super easy, I think, to just have like a generic cover letter that you want to use and for every single application. And it can be super, super beneficial to tailor those materials. And of course, that's time consuming and it's hard. And it's super tempting to just kind of cast as wide a net as you can in the hopes that you pull in more jobs. And also, that's kind of when those typos and mistakes can creep in. And also, I think for a lot of places, or at least I know for Schwabe specifically, a lot of what they're looking for is really like not just why do you want to work at a firm or why do you want a job, but why do you want to work at Schwabe? Like, what is specific to the place that you're applying for? And if your application materials reflect that, it really shows the commitment and the interest that you have in them specifically. So that would be one thing I'd say. Also, doing your research on the firm is really, really great. And to the extent that you can tie things into your cover letter about why that firm specifically interests you because of certain work they do or certain practice areas they have or certain clients they have or anything like that, that's super helpful. And then the last thing I'd throw in is don't be afraid to get like a variety of perspectives and advice. The Career Center is great, and also they come from a particular perspective. Same with professors, same with other students. And so having that variety of perspectives can be really helpful to kind of figure out how you want to actually move forward with tailoring your materials, because you'll get different advice from different people, and it comes down to how you want to decide you want to represent yourself, I think. So that'd be my advice.
And just to tag on a little bit to what Malcolm was saying about doing your research on the firm, the firm's website is great for that. Obviously, you can learn about their attorneys, about their practice areas, cases that they've been working on. Don't be afraid, I would say, also to reach out to attorneys that work at that firm and just talk to them, do informal interviews, because sometimes it's hard to know, okay, I think I want to work at this firm. It has a good reputation, but it's hard to actually have something genuine that you can communicate about why you want to work there, because you're kind of working in the abstract. You haven't worked there, so you don't know what it's like. So definitely feel free to reach out and see if you can chat with someone, or if someone has a connection at the firm. That gives you more of a base to draw on when you're trying to articulate what about this firm. It's nice if you can say, hey, I talked with Lauren and we talked about the culture at the firm and what have you.
I have one last thing, a quick anecdote that popped up in my brain when Julia was talking about kind of making yourself more personable and kind of showing your personality in your application materials. I've heard from folks, I know one person in particular that they put this little section at the bottom of their resume that says like special interests. And one of their special interests is that they are like a beef jerky connoisseur and they just love to like find new beef jerkies that they love. And like they said, in any interview they've ever had, like the interviewer always, without a doubt, asks them about their beef jerky interests. And it's just like this really easy, it's one line on their resume and it's like a really weird thing that you would never think to include, but it's like really gotten a lot for her, I think, in terms of creating conversation and connections.
And for us, I'd add one other thing is we're looking at community connections too, connections with your communities. And I say that because, you know, my firm's a little different than everyone else here. You know, we're small comparatively. You know, there's 10 of us and 3 of my partners started out as clerks here in the firm. So, you know, we inevitably, and this probably bridges between the interview process and application process, we're always really interested about, you know, why folks are clerking. Is this just to get the experience, to get exposed to this thing, or are you actually looking for, you know, is this something where you would consider working with for us? You know, because frankly, from our perspective, and again, I know for some of the larger firms, they have different kinds of clerk positions. You know, we're not always in a position where we can hire associates who are clerks, but we definitely have a mind to, when we hire clerks, it's someone that we would consider on the first instance, interviewing for an associate position should that occur. So we're really looking for someone that's really thoughtful about, you know, where they're going. And what their connection with the community, whether this is temporary or just getting exposure to something new, and all those things influence our decisions in hiring.
Thank you. And I think we all are somewhat touched on this, but is there anything in particular, and Julia, I know you mentioned maybe like personal stories, but anything else that anyone wanted to talk about as far as making your application material stand out? And I guess Malcolm also referenced the beef jerky connoisseur thing, but any other little tidbits on that, or something maybe you've done in your materials, or thinking back to when you were applying? And if not, if we feel like we covered it in the last question, we can also look to the next.
I have one comment on this, and it's kind of a sticky one, and I don't know my, you know, exact position, so please take it with, you know, just these are thoughts. But as a person who was a diversity fellow, interestingly, my applications for my position were very based in my personal identity. And I think that's different when you move into OCI, where that's not like the prompt of the application, but I think it still presents a really unique opportunity to talk about yourself and your identity, and maybe why that impacts your interest in law or your interest in being at a firm or any of those things. And that's not to say that you have to do that. And I think that by no means should you feel obligated to divulge like personal identity pieces in your application materials. And also, like, firms are absolutely looking to diversify their associates, to diversify their you know, workforce and employees, and especially attorneys. And I think that it also does present a unique opportunity to kind of leverage that identity piece and use it as an asset in terms of that job search. So yeah, I think that's a complicated question, and it brings a lot about like what you want to talk about and what you want to like divulge to your panelists and all those kinds of things. But it can be a unique way of, I think, making your application materials more personal, specific and identifiable to you, unique.
Yeah, I just dovetail on that to say that I think that any kinds of those things, you probably don't think about it, but it generally, when I say community, it means that you, for whether that's an identity-based issue or other interest, that you've been involved, and that's a way to demonstrate your ability to work with people, leadership ability, communication ability, organizational ability. You know, especially for folks that may be K to JD and don't have a lot of work experience, because again, you know, that's great if you are super book smart. That doesn't tell me as a hiring attorney that you can engage with other humans, that you can be a team player, that you can work with people. Those kinds of skills that are, you know, they're just so important, that you have empathy, that you can sit with a client and have empathy. I mean, these are the things that's like, you can learn how to write the brief and give us the information. But as far as a whole attorney, any way that you can show your skills in working with other people, digesting information, and being involved is great.
Okay, thank you. Anyone who would like to chime in, And we talked a little bit about researching the firm, but how are ways that students can demonstrate an interest in your firm? And I know we have different locations too, and I know that Eugene firm base versus Portland is a different thing, so maybe we can talk about that as well.
I'll jump in real quick. I think to tack on to the piece about like asking existing attorneys at that place for like an informational interview or to discuss or something. One really good way to go about that too is to actually ask the Career Center if they know an alumni or if they know someone specific that might be better to reach out to. Because it is super easy. I think, I don't know, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know I've had experiences where I sent emails to attorneys and just never heard back because they have no idea who I am and they're very busy. And to have that little point of connection where I said, Felipe at the Career Center said that you might be willing to, like, that can be really helpful. So that's one thought for me. And I think demonstrates the interest, like you've gone and talked to someone and that who suggested that you reach out to. And then another thing is, I don't know about other firms, but Schwabe on occasion hosts like events. This is harder with the Eugene Portland question. But for anybody who is going to like Portland for their 3L year, or if you're able to make the trip up for certain events, whether they be networking events or dinners, or Schwabe sometimes hosts just like speaker events where you can chime in by Zoom. So to the extent you're able to attend those things and then be able to say like, oh, I'll point to those as things that you demonstrated interest in the firm, that can be really powerful, I think, in showing your long-term commitment.
Hey, I'll add to that too. If you know people from the firm, or if you like have a callback and you see the folks who you'll be meeting with, I always check their LinkedIn's to see if I have any mutual connections or if they're on boards where they have a mutual connection with an attorney that I do know well, and then I'll reach out to the attorney that I do know and ask them, about the attorney and what the reputation of the firm is. And so sometimes that's a way for, if I, can't reach all the way to an attorney at the firm, I've brought up like, oh, I know this attorney who I know that you're on the board with, and she says great, that great things about you and great things about your, what she's heard about your experience. So if you can't reach all the way, like, check LinkedIn, and you'd be surprised at how you can try to connect yourself with either someone on your callback panel or just someone at the firm at all.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many people come to interviews and they've never looked at the webpage, right? They don't know. And for a small firm, you can get a lot of information about us without, a whole lot of time. I know it's a little different for some of the bigger firms with hundreds of attorneys, but, if you're going to a firm with 10 attorneys and we have specific practice areas, there's a lot of information you can find out. And because we're here locally, making that connection is pretty easy. If people reach out to us, we generally will respond. I won't promise that always happens, but we will. And especially if you have a practice area that you are specifically interested in, you can identify whoever the attorney is in that area that you're interested in. So.
And then when you talk to that person, this is probably maybe cover this later, but when you do talk to that person, if you are able to connect with them, just as Julia was mentioned a moment ago, make sure that you have things that you're ready to talk about, that you want to talk about, questions that you're prepared. It's always an easy ask to ask the attorney to talk about their practice area, or maybe a case that they've worked on. That's easy ground.
Okay, yeah, and I'm just reiterating the point of the Career Center's here all summer. Feel free to reach out. We're always willing to help. And Rachelle's point about LinkedIn is like well taken, because it's the best for finding where people work. Like if a student comes in and says, who do we know who works at a place? I mean, sometimes I off the top of my head, but like if I don't, I can just go, well, let's look at LinkedIn. Oh, here's who works at Stoel and has worked there in the last 20 years. So it's a great resource. And if they're an Oregon Law alum, they're more likely to respond when you say, I'm also an Oregon Law student and I'm looking at your firm. That bit of information goes a long way for them actually responding, even if they are a little busy. And if they are too busy, there'll probably be another one we'll talk to. Let's move to the next question. So cover letters, what works, you know, and I know this can, you know, and what have you seen that you thought, wow, that was really great, and maybe some cover letter examples of something you're like, well, maybe this didn't really work the way they thought it was working.
I think Julia mentioned this already, but proofread it. I've had a couple that I've reviewed that have had the wrong firm name. And that is pretty much, I mean, it's pretty much a fatal error if that occurs. I don't, even a stellar candidate is going to have a hard time getting past that. I think people are of different minds, but I am of the mind that short and to the point. Unless you really have something that is important that you want to share and that, you know, you need to devote some time to that. You'll be applying, no one's expecting you to be a Supreme Court justice, you know, you'll be applying at an entry level, and it doesn't need to be pages and pages. And I've seen that too. And it's just sort of onerous.
What about what about anything? How do you feel about humor in a cover letter? Like I know there's probably different opinions. And then also, does anyone have any thoughts? And I know this is not a yes or no or always, but like, how much personality do you like to see in a cover letter versus like, give me the facts and the background? Do you have any thought? Anyone have thoughts on that? And that's just my own curiosity.
Well, I think, Lauren, you're the one that said, you know, don't reiterate everything in your cover letter that's already in your resume. It doesn't give us any more information. I don't know, you know, the humor, I'm trying to think back to see if there's one that like it made me laugh, and I can't think of that, but definitely the personality and, you know, demonstrating you do know something about the firm, that you have tailored it to the firm, that you're aware of what it is the firm does and what your interest is, what you're going to bring to the table that maybe isn't obvious from your resume. Yeah, personality, I think, is huge. And to the extent you have the skill in a cover letter to bring out your personality, I think that that's great, because, you know, a dry, like, blah, 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 blah. So thankful for this opportunity for you to read this thing. And well, you know, it's like, okay, whatever. Yeah, I mean, maybe your resume is going to carry you, but when you're looking through a stack of these things, it's definitely something that shows who you are is great.
And I think too, it sort of depends on the overall facts and circumstances. If you're an excellent candidate with excellent grades and you have a dry cover letter, you know, you have a chance of getting into the interview, and we'll see your personality then. If you're not the type of person that it feels natural to you to be funny in a cover letter, I would steer towards the dry and don't try to force it in, because that's probably not going to be too successful.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Rachelle, you just
No, go ahead, Malcolm.
Oh, I was just gonna add, it's just, this is a little bit of a reiteration, but it's just such a great opportunity to talk about something that maybe either wasn't the perfect fit on your resume or didn't make it onto your resume, or I think like there are things that maybe wouldn't get put on the resume that can still really show your community, like your community involvement, your commitment long-term. I remember with my diversity application, I talked about like a fundraiser I did in high school, and like it was to donate to an LGBTQ organization, and it was like, this felt very impactful to showing this like long-term demonstrated commitment to like increasing diversity efforts. And also there was no way to put that on my resume. It was like from high school. It was a weird little thing. So I think that is one thing I'd say. And then the other also is a cover letter can be a great opportunity to say the connection that you have to the firm, whether it's like, you know, someone like Rachelle was saying, you know someone on the board who's also on the board with an attorney member, or an attorney recommended that you apply, or things like that. I think the cover letter is a good opportunity to put in that personal connection.
And I just wanted to add a little bit onto Lauren's point. Like and I think it goes well with Malcolm's point too, is that if you don't, like, if you have these opportunities like Malcolm just gave examples of, do it. If you don't panic. Like, do not kill yourself and stay up like and work on a cover letter for like 25 hours straight. It should be one page. So if you like are struggling to include these things, then don't. Like, just do, you know, like Lauren said, they might be dry. And I kind of felt that way in that, like, the things I had to talk about were already on my resume. I worked at a law firm for 3 years before law school, and I got so much amazing experience. So I kind of talked just more about that experience and how much I love litigating. I remember the Career Center really, really pushed me to add an interest section on my resume, and I fought it. I ultimately did. I fought it so hard because I'm like, I don't have any interest. My head is so buried in the books. And it's so funny because then the next year the pandemic came and I have like a whole list of hobbies I could have had on my resume now. But I at least, put some generic things and people still ask me about them. But so like, I felt so boring when I was doing it. But I knew that my personality would really show in the interviews. So I kind of found that balance. So if you feel like, you can make up for those things in the interview, but you don't necessarily know how to incorporate some of those things, it's okay too. So, but if you have these opportunities, like Malcolm and the other panelists have offered really, really great examples, like think hard, put some effort into how you can. If you can't, keep it, it should always just be one page. So.
Thank you. And the next one here, we get this question a lot. So say a student has a particular grade that they're not happy with, or maybe overall the firm is saying they're looking for this percentage top of the class, you're out of that, but close or maybe not even close. How do you feel about addressing that? Is that something you would like to see addressed in a cover letter, or do you think, and I know there's not going to be one piece of advice here, or do you think that's something like where, people are going to be providing transcripts anyways, you focus on the positive, and if they want to talk about that more in the interview, then that's when you talk about it. Any thoughts on that, and grades, and particular grades in a cover letter in your application materials?
Well, I think if the firm has indicated that they have a cutoff and you're below that cutoff, I think you almost sort of have to address it if you're interested in getting an interview, because most likely you won't have the opportunity to discuss it in an interview unless you can convince the firm that has that cutoff to get over that. So I think in that circumstance, you don't have anything to lose by addressing it. You should address it and say, this is why that doesn't matter. I'm still qualified. Otherwise, I think it just sort of depends. Definitely depends on, if there's an easy, succinct, articulable reason in other cases, where it's like you had a family illness, or you had something that is just, anyone would look at that and say, oh, of course, then I think, yeah, you should address that. And otherwise, just kind of think about it on an individual basis.
I would tend to agree with that approach. Yeah, I mean, focus on the positive. Again, if it's going to be a threshold issue to get you in the door, then you're going to have to explain it. But otherwise, I would focus on your strengths. If there's something that just stands out, then probably, yeah, especially if there is a good reason to discuss it. Grades in general, of course, everyone looks at the grades. At the same time, I've had enough exposure to folks who are like, I'm the 4-point student, but, they have flat personalities. They can't deal with people. They have no business experience. They have no work experience. There's a whole host of other things that you can focus on that make you a good attorney. Obviously, that there is a correlation between your ability to perform in school and ability to think and all of the things. But again, being the 4-point student in and of itself doesn't tell me that you're going to be an excellent attorney.
I'll just chime in really quick to say that I spoke to our recruiter about this because I was like, I don't know how to answer this question. And a lot of what he said was very similar to what's been said. So I'll throw my hat in to echo.
Okay. And we've touched on this, but maybe some other things have come to mind, but is there, in the application part, we'll move on to interview next, anything else common, errors to avoid? We've talked about typos in the cover letters, putting the wrong firm name, not researching the firm. Anything else coming to mind that anyone has right now?
The only thing about the process in general, and to the extent we only have a few folks, maybe some folks will watch down the line, To the extent you can tell your other classmates, I feel like folks self-select. To the extent you can encourage people that, you know, aren't the 4-point students to go through the process, to consider it, to apply. I would just encourage you, anyone that's on the fence, to really think about what they can bring to the table, and not shy away from it. Sorry, that was non-responsive, Felipe.
No. That is a common mistake too. There's a lot of self-selection, not just for OCI, but all kinds of opportunities. I always say, let them say no to you. You know, it's assuming you have the capacity to do the application process, this and other stuff. I mean, you know, clerkships, anything, you are worthy. So, and you can also talk to the Career Center. We're happy to talk you through, and we know lots of people have gone through the process and interviewed with these firms and others, so we can talk it over. Yeah, well, let's move on to the interview process, and maybe just as a bit of background, generally, and if you want to chime in what your firm does or what you've gone through, like generally for particularly the 1Ls who are now 2Ls, I guess. What most firms do is they have initial screening interviews called screening interviews that are usually pretty short, 15 to 30 minutes at most. Smaller firms can sometimes go longer. And then from that group, they will select a much smaller number for callbacks, and it's called a callback interview. Those usually take place at the firm, different formats depending on the firm, and maybe some of that, we'll talk about that a little bit. Often you'll meet multiple people. Some small firms you'll meet everyone, and kind of a more involved process. So there's a screener interviews, and that's what when you see in your communications about the OCI interview process, the August 7th through 11th, those are going to be the screener interviews. And then the firms individually set up these callback interviews that will happen after those initial interviews. So that's all my lead in to say, what tips do you have for preparing for the OCI screening interview process?
I can start. Oh, go for it.
Go ahead, Rachelle, please.
Felipe, you can stop me if things have changed since I've been there, but one thing I wasn't prepared, and I'll start with a lot of the things that we've already talked about for the application process you should do, like doing your research about the firm and about the person that you're going to be interviewing with, which I believe you're usually provided with that person's name ahead of time. But one thing during the screening interviews that I was not prepared for when I went through is that I did get some behavioral questions, which I did not think I would get it. And I thought that those would be for callbacks, since they can be a little bit more lengthy. And so unless there's like, so that's why I said, if any of them are like, if there's some rule that are like, we don't do that anymore for screening interviews, to stop me, but you should be prepared for sure and also when you're going into your callbacks. But I think behavioral questions take a lot of time to prepare for. But once you get it, like once you put that time into preparing for them, like they apply to any interview that you're going to go to. And by behavioral questions, I don't know how much you do these things in the career classes or not, but behavioral questions are things like, tell me about a time where you like had a conflict with a colleague and how you dealt with it, or tell me about a time where you displayed leadership, or things like that. And at first they felt really intimidating, and when you're not prepared for them, they're very intimidating. And like the interviewer doesn't really care what your response is. The interviewer cares about how you carry yourself through that response. So when you're answering a behavioral question, it's like the best advice I can give you is just be prepared with an example. And that might sound a lot easier than done. But when you look at examples of behavioral questions, you'll start to realize that like you can think of a scenario and it applies to like a bunch of different kinds of questions. Like the same example you can think of for the question of, tell me about a time that you've had a conflict with a colleague. That same story can also be applied to, tell me about a time where you displayed leadership, or tell me about a time where you faced a challenge at work, or something like that. And we don't really like the kind of examples that you could tell seem really small in real life. They're things that you don't really like reflect on very much. So that's why the preparation for them, so you can kind of think back to like that summer I worked here, or that's, you know, this time I was working on a project. So you have those scenarios like fresh in your mind, then it's just so much less intimidating when you're answering these questions, because you don't have to panic for the recall part, and you've already remembered that situation, so you can give a thoughtful answer. And it's not just about remembering the actual situation. You can give the thoughtful answer of how, you know, what you learned from it or how you handled it or whatever. And being caught off, like being unprepared for behavioral questions, it feels awful in the moment. That was the only screening, interview that I got behavioral questions for was the only callback that I did not get. And I even had the interviewer stop me at one point because I was so nervous and I was so unprepared for these questions that he'd ask me the question and I would do this big gasp, like I was getting ready to say something because I was like thinking, and he'd be like, stop, like you can think about it for a second. And when you're not so nervous and you've thought about these examples, you're not afraid to have pause and then say something thoughtful. But I was so nervous because I hadn't like recalled any of these memories, and I didn't want to just like completely embellish a story. So I felt like so I was like jumping into each one with just, and he's like, stop, like you need to think about what you're going to say first. So definitely behavioral questions. I hope that you don't get very many of them in your screenings. But I had one that was completely behavioral questions. So, and it doesn't hurt to prepare for them because you're going to get them in your callbacks to get them. So that's one of the biggest interview tips that I have.
Just a very, very short, that was great comment, Rachelle. And what I was going to say is actually the other side of the same coin. When I went into my OCI, the screening interviews, I was prepared for more of a formal interview style, more of a behavioral interview style. And so I did better in those interviews. I wasn't as prepared for what most of them were, at least when I went through it, which was sort of just get to know you. Are you someone that passes the vibe check, or are you someone that we would be interested in hanging out with and being around and being a colleague of? And so those ones were a little more stilted for me, which is to say that you don't know exactly what you're going to get. So being prepared for both and aware that either or could happen, I think is good.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in here. Like things have not generally changed. I mean, the biggest change is instead of actually being on campus, all the initial screening interviews are virtual now. But as far as behavioral questions, it can come up the interview where the person doesn't even really ask a question. They just kind of talk about the firm happens. And that can be kind of off-putting too, because you're like, oh, I prepared for this. And what did I do something wrong? Because they're just sharing information with me. And very casual. And it is hard to prepare. You can prepare, but sometimes it's just left up to the individual interviewer. And sometimes the firm also will just change how they're doing their process year to year. Often they'll just decide this is what we're trying this year. And they'll get into like, maybe they're real into behavioral analysis that year. And then next year they're like, that didn't work. Let's do something different. So I guess the advice is there will be many styles to prepare for. Yeah. So.
And we don't talk to each other. So, frankly, I don't know what other interviewers, what the different firms' approaches are. And frankly, depending on who from my firm would show up, you'd get a different set of questions because it's not a scripted state, part of it is you say something interesting and we follow up on it. So I think being prepared for all those things is probably the best bet.
Does anyone want to talk about sort of this is applied to both interviews, but like the idea of a callback interview, the process versus the screener interviews. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? And it will vary firm to firm, how they do it. Anyone want to share anything on those experiences?
I can share kind of what Schwabe does specifically, which is their screening interview is via Zoom, and then their callback interviews generally are in person, and their callbacks are with a panel of generally 3 or 4 attorneys at a time. And so I think how this translates to tips, like obviously You don't necessarily need pants for the Zoom interview, but you do for the in-person interview. That's like an obvious one. And then obviously, like things like voice inflection or body language, things like that, I think you have a lot more opportunity to display your personality and your demeanor and your ability to like put a client at ease or to speak to another human being, things like that. It's just generally easy to navigate those things in person than it is over Zoom, in terms of like cutting each other off over Zoom, or trying to figure out when they're done with their question and when you should start talking, and all of the things. So those are things to think about, at least. I don't know how other firms do it, but with Schwabe. And then just because callback interviews are a panel at Schwabe, if you haven't done a panel interview, or even if you have sometimes, it can just be so incredibly intimidating to have 3 or 4 attorneys basically just grilling you with these behavioral questions that you need to like have answers ready for. Often for like, you can do as much preparing as you want, and you might still get hit with that question that you never saw or thought about before this moment. So to the extent you can, like looking up questions ahead of time, if you can set up like a mock panel interview with peers, like I know that feels like a lot and feels very extra and like time consuming. And if I were in law school, I'll be honest, I wouldn't have done that, but I think it would be really helpful. Yeah, if you know who the panelists are, do your research on them. If you don't be afraid to ask if they can tell you who the panelists are ahead of time. If they can, just do LinkedIn search, things like that. But yeah, I'd say just that in-person versus Zoom factor can be a little bit of food for thought in terms of how you want to think about going into your interview.
Just to follow up on the research on each of your panels to the extent that you know who they are, that also comes in handy because you should always be prepared and this also goes to the screening interviews as well. You should always be prepared at the end of the interview for your interviewer to say, do you have any questions for me? And you should always have questions for the interviewer. And sometimes, it might be easier to come up with like less super generic questions if you know more about the person that's interviewing you or people that are interviewing you. Because you can ask, general questions about the firm, or there might be something specifically interesting about that person's practice that you might want to ask them. And remember, it's not always because you need the information, but you want to have a question to at least a question to ask them. And like a good example of a question that can come out of doing research on someone is like, like I said earlier, I'm in the general litigation group at my firm, but there are lots of litigators that have specialized in certain kinds of practice areas. And even today, I wonder, how did my colleague get so, like, how did this become your niche? And so, and there's not always one track of how someone becomes specialized in something. And I always think that that's a great question to ask, especially because the answer is usually really interesting. And it gives you a little bit of insight on how you may end up, if you were at this firm, how you could end up in a specific practice area with a specific focus. So always be prepared to ask questions, and something more than just the generic, like, do you like working here? Or, I think what you're looking for in a candidate is a good question. But maybe not for like every single interview you're in.
I would agree.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Julie.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is great advice. And just one really quick word of caution is, for the questions you're asking, make sure it's not stuff you could figure out in 5 seconds looking at the firm website, because I've certainly heard that where I've had a question come at me, and that's the first thought in my mind is like, how do you even open the web page for the firm? You would know the answer. But as far as kinds of questions, I think that that advice was great. Sorry, Malcolm, go ahead.
No, that was perfect. Then ties into what I was going to say too, which is just like Rachelle talked a lot about like asking folks about their practice or about how they got involved in their practice or their niche area or things like that. And Like even you can think about if folks are like on boards or oftentimes folks' profiles will like show the things that they're involved in. And a lot of times like they're really passionate about that stuff. One person I interviewed was like on the board of the Feral Cat Coalition in Oregon. And so I was like, well, of course I have to talk to you about cats. And so it was like not job related. I mean, sort of, she's on the board. It's not like a legal organization. We just ended up talking about cats, but it was like, you know, I had done enough research, showed interest that, you know, I saw that she was on this board, and then, you know, she was obviously incredibly thrilled to talk about her cats. So just giving people the opportunity to talk about what they're excited about, I think leaves a good taste in their mouth, so to speak.
And this is probably obvious in things that you already know, but it's a long day. The callback is a long day. Be prepared for multiple rounds with multiple people, possibly a lunch, depending on, you know, what the firm does. I think that is very common. So just, you know, be prepared for that ahead of time.
Okay, thank you. I was looking at the next few questions. I think we touched a little bit already on like our thoughts on reaching out to individuals as part of the interview process. And the other question about virtual versus in person, I think kind of virtual for callbacks or virtual for screeners is kind of the in the air, is at least for firms that are out of town. So maybe we'll just go ahead, in the interest of time, jump to the last couple of questions I have here, which one of them will be pretty quick. It's just your thoughts on thank you correspondence. Do you recommend it? Do you do it? Email? Does anyone actually send letters anymore? What did you do? And then kind of in conclusion, before we open up to students, any other common mistakes that you occur to you as you want to give some final advice to the listeners here?
I've gotten some great follow-up thank yous, and it's noticeable. I've gotten actual thank you cards that are really sweet. And even for, you know, and I always try to leave it too, and different firms have different approaches, that even if we don't hire someone, that I'm available as a resource in the community and happy to talk to students. But yes, back to the point, I think the thank you follow-up is a great opportunity to show that you really are interested and you really appreciated the experience. And, you know, you can, again, latch onto something that was said or you discussed or any of those things. It's just another opportunity to create a connection, make yourself stand out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've always been told and kind of operated under the belief that like it's not a check down to send an email thank you, but it kind of is a check up to send a thank you note. So like which makes it sound like it is a check down to send the email, which I truly don't believe it is. It's wonderful to send the email, thank you. And the recruiter at Schwabe, I specifically asked him this question too, and he's like, no, like a thank you via email is wonderful. At the same time, my anecdotal experience is that I walk into his office and I see all of the thank you cards that he's been sent, physical thank you cards, they're on his shelf. Like, so they're meaningful, they're valuable. And I think it kind of goes to that point that there's that little special touch that makes it a little more personal. But sending a thank you via email is wonderful and I absolutely recommend it. And I think if you can do that, then do not feel bad that you didn't send a thank you card, is my perspective.
And I'll just add really quick, make notes in your notebook, like Malcolm would have written next to that interviewer, feral cats. So if you connected about something and you can put something other than just like, thank you for your time and things like that, if you can include, you know, something specific that you talked about, it's really meaningful because you see a lot of people on your callbacks. And so it's more meaningful to, if there's something you talked about that is specific, and write a note because you might forget because it's a very long day.
Yeah, that's a great point, because if you're interviewing with a bunch of people, if you can make contemporaneous notes, it's very helpful, because after you've talked to 10 or 15 people, sometimes it's hard to distinguish every conversation. Yeah, and I guess let's just go ahead. Does anyone have any questions? Any of the students, or I could throw some out there. It looks like maybe a head nod there, Chloe. I don't know. Yeah, you got something? Yeah. What would you like to know?
Hi, yeah. First, thank you everyone. That was really helpful. And yeah, feel so lucky that so many attorneys volunteered their time to talk to us. So thank you for that. My name is Chloe. My pronouns are they, them. And my question is about cover letters. So a little circle back. Is it acceptable to convey your openness to different practice areas instead of this commitment to like a specific and niche practice area? Or does that imply you haven't done research on the firm?
I think it's good to know what, it's good to be honest about where you're at, right? Not about not having done research, but you've done research. If you have a variety of interests, that's perfectly fine. You know, not everyone knows that I'm going to be an estate planner and that's what they're going to do and that's what they're going to spend the rest of their life doing. So it's okay to have a variety of interests and say, hey, I have a variety of, these are the reasons I'm interested in these things. And I'm not sure where the best fit is, but I'm open to those things. I mean, I'm in a small firm, right? So the idea of pigeonholing someone right away is probably not, going to happen. We're going to expose people to a lot of different areas, and different firms have different attitudes towards that. But no, I don't think you have to know that what you want to do, at whatever stage in your life you're at now for the rest of your life, and show that in your cover letter, and just more of a thoughtful approach to what it is that you are interested in.
Yeah, I would completely agree with every word of that. And I would just also say, if you happen to be a person that does have something that you're really interested in, like let's say you really want to be a patent attorney, you probably shouldn't put that in your cover letter if you're applying somewhere that you have no chance of being a patent attorney at. They don't do patent law, things like that. So the flip side is true too. Just kind of be mindful about that, and probably you just wouldn't want to work there. But yeah, or if you have, maybe they don't do any constitutional law practice, and that's just your dream is to do that. Probably be a little out of place to harp on that.
And I'll just add, Felipe, I don't know how much the firm talked to you about whether they're slotting or not, but my answer to your question, Chloe, would depend on the firm, and I don't know how much ahead of time you'll know this, but for example, Stoel, which is still the case now, but when I was applying and I didn't know this at the time, Stoel, we don't slot our summers. Like, we want that they get to try, they get to come, like they get to pick from a pool of any kind of assignments that are submit from any practice area, and we talk to them at the end of the summer about where they might want to be. My year at Perkins, and I don't know if they still do this, but Perkins had 4 summer slots, and there were business, litigation, environmental, and real estate and land use. And those were the 4 they were accepting. And I don't know, like, Felipe, you can chime in, like, I don't know how much information you have before that, but so that's just an example of like where it would matter. If you're not interested in one of those 4, or if they're just getting, all their cover letters are people interested in business, I don't know, maybe that might influence like who they, will consider and who they won't. But I think, I could be wrong, but I think a lot more firms really tend to leave slotting open, which I really appreciate. And I think a lot of law students don't know what they want. And I think that's why Stoel moved away from slotting. It just lets, try what you want, and then we'll talk about it at the end of the summer.
Just to quickly chime in, Schwabe is the same in that we just have a general project pool that all projects get thrown into. So I would say that the majority of our summer associates don't know what practice area, like they might have things that they know that they're interested in, and when they go into the summer, they're going to be looking for those projects in the project pool. But for the most part, that's not the case, or they are just very flexible in terms of their interests and where they go.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on what Lauren said about, if you want to be a patent attorney, don't put that in the letter for the firm that doesn't do that kind of work. And I've seen that, where somebody's like, oh, I want to go do this thing in this area. It's like, well, why are you applying to my firm then? Do I put the time, energy, and resource into you, right, if you don't really want to be here? So, and again, I've seen that. So just be thoughtful and, think about where you're applying, and know that, this is time and energy from us as well. So, tailor it to where you want to be and what you want to do. And certainly don't include something that the firm doesn't even do as oh, I want to do this thing. unless you have a really good explanation about why it is that you know, are still applying for a job with this firm.
Thank you so much.
And sorry, just really quick to add to that too, if you're struggling with feeling like you're kind of, you feel like you might be saying like, I don't really know what I want to do, talk about the things that you like, even if you're not talking about a practice group, you can maybe say like, I really like to write, or I really like to research. That can be applied to different practice areas. And it shows that you're still trying to like engage with, you know, the reader in your cover letter, that, you know, you're not just like, oh, I'll do anything. So if you're feeling like, you know, a little bit uncomfortable about just like leaving yourself open and not seeming like you have any direction, you can focus on something that's not necessarily practice group specific. And that even goes like litigation versus transactional. Both of those areas can take you, you know, it gets even more specific than that. So, you know, you can still talk about your interests that still make you, that can, you know, mold into different practice groups that, you know, are football.
Now you can talk about class, right? You can talk about one of your classes and something that you love and that maybe you didn't even realize you loved based on your experience in school.
Right, that's great advice. I think my initial fear was that if I don't say maybe, oh, well, I'm really interested in this area, you do really well in this area, I see you have a bunch of attorneys who have won awards in this area, then there isn't as great an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge of the firm, and that your interest is a good way to explain why their firm is a good place for you.
Yeah, I think that fear totally makes sense, but yeah, to assuage that fear a little bit, I think everything everyone has said is a really good way of approaching that and showing that you're still interested, you've still done your research, you still have interest in law and your legal classes and all of these things. You just don't know exactly what area you want to end up in. And a lot of the places that participate in OCI, I think, have multiple opportunities and avenues in that regard. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as someone who looks at a lot of cover letters for 1Ls, you're not alone, not knowing exactly what you want to do. I'd say the vast majority of students are still, and many grads are still figuring out exactly what they want to do. So that's totally fine. Well, I know we're at time already, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I assume these panelists, maybe I shouldn't assume, but I'm sure you're open to the possibility of maybe a student reaching out to you if they had additional questions. I'll say that with the thumbs up. And when I sent out an email to all the students, I linked to your profile, so they all should have access to your information. And with that, I'll just say once again, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time, and look forward to hopefully you all enjoy your summer.
Thank you, Felipe.
Thanks,
Thank you
Felipe.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.
You all.